House arrest was supposed to protect the rebellious schoolgirl from trouble. Instead, it became her last day. Her body was found a day later, 30 kilometers from her home. There were almost no tracks, but one suspect emerged, who still denies his guilt despite a life sentence. The teenage years of children can turn parents' lives into a real nightmare. Quarrels, disobedience, and endless conflicts wear anyone out. Sometimes disciplinary measures don't go according to plan. But is that a reason for murder? Especially when the evidence raises as many doubts as it does in this story. On September 19, 1981, in a Phoenix suburb called Mesa, Gina Gamble was born, state of Arizona, United States. She was the second child in the family. Her older brother, Jaron, was born 2 years earlier. By the time the girl was born, her parents' marriage was already falling apart. The relationship deteriorated daily. Those who knew the family later said the atmosphere in the home was tense. The divorce happened before the little girl was even a year old. The daughter stayed with her mother. Her biological father simply disappeared from their lives, as if he had vanished. After some time, the girl's mother remarried. Her chosen one was a man named Douglas Mauser. He turned out to be a reliable family man, someone you could count on. Without hesitation, he took on the role of a father to his new wife Kathy's son and daughter. At that time, the children were 2 and 4 years old. Douglas easily found common ground with both of them. From a young age, the boy and girl saw him as their real dad. Neighbors later recounted that the family seemed exemplary. Meanwhile, her biological father showed little interest in their lives. He had started another family. He called rarely. He visited even less often. Douglas, Kathy, and the children were always together. A bond formed between the stepfather and Gina, indistinguishable from that of a real father and daughter. When the girl turned 8, the whole family moved. Due to the head of the family's job, they relocated to Modesto, California, a small city in the Central Valley. There, they settled in a private home on a quiet street. Kathy got a job as an aerobics instructor at a local fitness center. Douglas worked in a laboratory. The organization had a very strict security system. Important research was conducted there. Access control, cameras at the entrance, guards checking everyone. The high level of responsibility was compensated by a good salary. For many years, the Mausers lived peacefully and happily, a typical middle-class American family. But everything changed when both children entered their teenage years. Jaron went downhill. He started drinking, even dealt illegal substances. But otherwise, he kept a low profile. He didn't steal or commit serious offenses. He stayed in the shadows. Jenna stayed away from crime, possibly due to her age. But her personality changed more drastically than her brother's. She turned into a defiant, aggressive girl, a classic teenage rebel. At first, her mother and stepfather tried to handle it themselves. They talked, they punished, they tried to get through to her. Gradually, it became clear they couldn't manage without professional help. After several visits to a psychologist, the girl was diagnosed with oppositional defiant disorder. The name perfectly described her behavior. She constantly lost control of herself, experiencing baseless anger and resentment. She was short-tempered, hostile. She deliberately provoked others, intentionally trying to annoy everyone. The psychologist explained to the parents that it was a disorder, that the child needed therapy. But therapy didn't help. Despite treatment, Gina continued to argue constantly with her parents. It's important to remember this took place in the 90s. Parenting approaches were different then. The clinic wasn't helping them handle the teenager, and the parents often resorted to punishments, the old school way. In response, the girl started running away from home. Each time she was found at a friend's house, and it would end with her being put on house arrest, forbidden to go out, forbidden to use the phone. It got to the point where punishment became something normal for the schoolgirl, a usual state of being. However, it had little effect on her behavior. The cycle was complete. On the morning of Saturday, October 14, 1995, Kathy was getting ready for work. She had another aerobics class to teach. She got up early, had breakfast, dressed in her workout clothes. Before leaving, the mother looked into her daughter's room to say goodbye and remind her about the house arrest. Gina was forbidden to leave the house or even use the phone. The girl was lying in bed. She looked at her mother, nodded, said nothing. That day, she was supposed to be alone. Her older brother would only be back after lunch, and her stepfather would be leaving for work. He left for the lab about half an hour after his wife. There was no one to supervise the rebel. The parents knew their daughter might take advantage of the situation. They warned her that running away would only make things worse and increase the punishment. The girl listened in silence. She looked away. Around 1 in the afternoon, Kathy returned home. The class went as usual. She was tired, but in a good mood. She approached the front door and discovered something strange. The door was locked from the inside. This immediately alarmed her because no one in the family locked the door from the inside during the day when they were home. They didn't have that habit. The woman immediately assumed her daughter had run away again. If Gina had been home, the door would have been unlocked. She took out her keys, unlocked the door, went inside. Once in the entryway, the mother first checked her suspicion. She went through the house, looked in her daughter's room. Empty. She checked the bathroom, the kitchen, the living room. Her daughter was nowhere. Gina hadn't left any notes. She had simply vanished. Besides the locked door, Kathy didn't notice anything suspicious. The house was tidy, no signs of a struggle or disorder. She decided her daughter had gone to a friend's house again, a common occurrence. She didn't give it much thought, thinking the girl would be back soon. She'll come back and get another scolding. In the 90s, cell phones weren't yet widespread. It was impossible to instantly contact Gina and find out what had happened. The woman waited. She sat on the couch, watched television. But her daughter didn't show up and didn't call from other phones. Time passed. Kathy started to get nervous. She went to the nearest neighbors, knocked on doors, asked if they had seen the girl. No one had. She went to the homes of several of her daughter's friends. To her surprise, the girl wasn't anywhere. Moreover, no one had seen her on the street since that morning. In the time before the mother's return, nothing unusual had happened. A quiet Saturday in a residential area. The woman had to return empty-handed. At that moment, Kathy began to feel truly worried. But she tried to push away the bad thoughts. The girl is just out somewhere. She'll be back soon. A few hours later, Douglas and their son Jaron returned home. Kathy immediately told them what had happened. Her voice was trembling. The parents decided to search the neighborhood. The man and the teenager went to check the places Gina most frequented: the mall, the park, friends' houses. Kathy stayed home, planning to meet her daughter and give her a good talking to. She sat by the phone, waited for a call. To not waste time, she called all the friends whose numbers she knew again. She dialed the number, waited for an answer. Asked the same thing. To her astonishment, no one had seen Gina that morning. During the search, the situation didn't change. The schoolgirl hadn't turned up at anyone's house. Everything looked more and more alarming. The sun was setting. By evening, Douglas and Jerome returned empty-handed. They couldn't find the 14-year-old girl. All her acquaintances they met along the way had nothing new to report. The family looked at each other. They were silent for a while. They decided it was time to call the police. Despite the late hour, law enforcement took the situation seriously. A 14-year-old girl, missing all day. They immediately began a search operation. Kathy was extremely worried. She couldn't fall asleep until late at night. She lay in bed, stared at the ceiling, listened for the phone to ring. The next morning, October 15th, 1995, the whole family was awakened by a phone call, sharp, insistent. The mother rushed to the phone, hoping to hear that Gina had been found alive. She grabbed the receiver, held her breath. Instead, a detective reported, early that morning, 30 kilometers from the city, the naked body of a teenage girl had been discovered. His voice was calm, professional. She had been thrown into a ditch near a wooded area. The cause of death was strangulation. The woman felt her legs give way. The police were trying to identify the victim and had reviewed all the missing person reports. One of the first they came across was the report from Kathy and Douglas. Now they were asked to come to the morgue for an identification, immediately. The whole way there, the woman prayed it wasn't her daughter. She sat in the car next to Douglas, looked out the window. Her lips moved. Her hands clutched her purse. But at the morgue, the parents saw what they feared most. Lying before them was the body of 14-year-old Gina. Kathy moved closer, looked, turned away, covered her face with her hands. Douglas stood nearby. He looked at his stepdaughter's body, was silent. He nodded to the detective. Yes, it's her. After the official identification, detectives began the investigation. The parents were offered seats, glasses of water, tissues. By that point, it was already clear the girl had not died of natural causes. Some details were immediately obvious. For example, the crime was not related to rape. Despite the lack of clothing, no characteristic signs of assault were found. The body was clean, which indicated it had been moved. The skin had been washed. No traces of dirt or dust. The girl was likely killed elsewhere, and her body was simply dumped in the ditch to destroy evidence. The teenager had no defensive wounds. Her hands were clean. Her nails were intact. She hadn't fought back, or didn't have time to. However, the medical examiner noticed strange marks on the upper part of her legs. Judging by their structure, they appeared after death from prolonged pressure. The expert examined these marks for a long time, photographed them, took measurements. Unfortunately, it was not possible to immediately determine and understand their origin. Something had pressed on the body after death, but what exactly was unclear. The body was thoroughly examined, as were the ditch and the surrounding area. Detectives combed the area, looked for clothing, clues, tire tracks. This yielded no results that could help direct the investigation. The ditch was empty. The ground around it was hard, almost no tracks. The search for the killer began by gathering information from the victim's close relations and all her acquaintances. On Thursday, October 19, 1995, the schoolgirl's body was buried. Initially, the family planned a traditional farewell ceremony. Black suits, a closed casket, a church. However, they spoke a lot with Gina's circle of friends. Her best friend, Sarah, said the deceased couldn't stand it when people were sad. It wasn't in her character. The schoolgirl liked it when everyone had fun, even in tragic moments. So the parents decided to arrange a less somber event. They gathered Gina's relatives and friends in the yard of their home, something like a picnic. They set up tables, brought food. People stood in small groups, spoke quietly. Of course, everyone was sad, expressed their condolences, and hoped the perpetrator would soon be punished. But the atmosphere was lighter than at a typical funeral. Meanwhile, law enforcement officers were trying to find any leads. There was no information, so they began to investigate the circumstances of the morning the girl disappeared from home and was killed. They reconstructed the timeline, minute by minute. Despite her mother's prohibition, it turned out Gina had made several phone calls. Detectives pulled the phone records. The last one was a conversation with her best friend, Sarah. She was not just her best friend, but also a classmate, the closest person to Gina. When the police spoke with the girl, she confirmed the morning call. She sat in her living room, was nervous, fidgeted with a glass of water in her hands. Judging by the time, it happened almost immediately after Douglas left for work. Sarah said the conversation was normal, typical teenage chat. Gina complained about the punishment, promised to convince her family to let her come over in the afternoon. Her voice was normal, not scared. However, the schoolgirl noted a strange detail. In the middle of the conversation, Gina suddenly hung up, without even saying goodbye. Just a click and silence. This seemed unusual. Gina didn't even call back after that, and they always called each other back. In Sarah's opinion, it was related to the punishment. She assumed one of her parents had come home, unexpectedly. The girl didn't want her mother or father to catch her breaking the rule, so she hung up abruptly. Sarah just waited for a return call. She waited for an hour, then 2. Then she forgot about it. After that, detectives went to the family's home. They inspected it, went through all the rooms. They examined the victim's room especially carefully. A typical teenager's room, posters on the walls, clothes scattered about. The bed was unmade. They didn't find anything incriminating here either. There were no signs of a struggle in the house. The furniture was in place. Nothing was broken. But Gina's diary fell into the detective's hands. It was on the nightstand by her bed. There was an entry from that morning, made on the day of the murder. The victim complained about the strictness of her mother and stepfather. The handwriting was messy, hurried. Much more interesting were the entries from the last 6 months before the tragedy. Detectives flipped through the pages, read. In them, she wrote about her crush on 2 guys. One was a 14-year-old peer from her class. The other was an 18-year-old young man. Thus, the detectives had their first 2 main suspects. Both young men were quickly tracked down, brought in for questioning. After speaking with the classmate, they realized he was not involved in the murder. He had an alibi, confirmed by several witnesses. He was at work. Several people saw him. The second young man didn't even know about Gina's crush. He sat across from the detectives, looked bewildered. She had seen him several times at the local mall and simply fell in love, although they had never spoken or had any contact. A one-sided teenage crush. The young man's words were also quickly confirmed. As expected, the medical examiner found no signs of rape. The girl might have been undressed intentionally to confuse the investigation, to distract attention. They speculated it was a murder committed in a fit of rage. Additionally, the missing clothing could indicate an attempt to hide the perpetrator's tracks. The killer took the clothes with him. Perhaps there was some evidence on them. He was likely smart or had previous criminal experience. He knew what detectives would look for first. Given these circumstances, they focused on Jana's immediate circle. The killer not only managed to get rid of all the evidence, he knew the family's routine well. Too well. He knew the parents would be away that day, the brother would also be gone, and the girl would be alone. He knew what time. It was someone close. Kathy worked as an aerobics instructor, interacting with a large number of people, dozens of students every day. This allowed them to quickly confirm her alibi and remove her from the list of suspects. She was at work. Many witnesses. Then they turned their attention to the stepfather. They found that over the past 12 years, he had grown very close to the victim. They had a warm relationship. This was confirmed by everyone who knew the family well. Neighbors, teachers, family friends. When detectives met with him, it was obvious. He was taking the loss very hard. He sat at the table in the interrogation room, stared at one spot. His eyes were red. The man had no trouble with the law, not a single offense. He seemed an unlikely suspect, but standard procedure required checking him out. Douglas stated that on the morning of the murder, he was at work. He left the house shortly after his wife. A normal workday. When he was leaving the family home, Gina was in her room, cleaning. He saw her alive for the last time. He claimed he arrived at the lab for a few hours and performed his usual tasks during the day shift. A typical Saturday. Work, paperwork, analyses. When the police began to check his alibi, they first turned to the lab's security cameras. A secure facility. Cameras everywhere. To their surprise, they could not confirm Douglas's words. The security service reported that Saturday the cameras were not working. A technical malfunction. A very convenient malfunction. His colleagues also didn't notice him at the workplace. No one remembered seeing Douglas that day. Even more suspicious was the security guard's statement. He sat across from the detectives, spoke confidently. He reported that he hadn't seen Douglas all day, and he always noticed who came in and out. It was his job. When the man was asked about this, he became very flustered. His face turned red. But he considered it some kind of misunderstanding. Maybe the guard just didn't notice. It happens. However, he himself couldn't say the name of the guard on duty that Saturday, as if he hadn't seen him at all. Yet, upon arriving for his shift, he would have inevitably encountered him, to show his pass, to sign the logbook. After all, it was a secure facility with strict controls. No one could just walk in. This looked strange. The detectives exchanged glances. Suspicion against the stepfather grew stronger. Nevertheless, the man didn't give up. He leaned forward, remembered a detail. He said that during his lunch break, he went to a fast food restaurant near the lab. He ordered a burger, fries, coffee. The detectives decided to check this claim and went to the establishment. Curiously, checking the surveillance cameras here also yielded no results. The manager threw up his hands. It turned out to be a very unfortunate coincidence. The cameras at the fast food restaurant weren't working that day either. Another technical malfunction. Thus, Gina's stepfather had two alibis, and neither could be confirmed. Furthermore, the man was the last person to see the schoolgirl alive before leaving the house. The detectives created a timeline. Everything pointed to him. These circumstances strengthened their suspicions. The police focused on finding evidence of Douglas's involvement in the teenager's murder. At this stage, there was still no solid evidence linking Douglas to the murder. On the victim's body, no hair, no attacker's DNA, and none of her clothing was found. Clean. The stepfather had no injuries, no scratches, no bruises. However, Gina also lacked signs of a struggle. They got a warrant to search the man's car. Detectives carefully inspected the vehicle. They found nothing in the trunk or the cabin either. Empty. However, detectives discovered an important detail. Shortly before the inspection, the car had been thoroughly washed. Douglas claimed he went to the car wash after work. It was a normal thing for him to do, every Saturday, a habit. Detectives concluded he could have destroyed evidence this way: blood, fibers, anything. In a desperate attempt to find any information, they checked the tire treads and the undercarriage of the car. They put the car on a lift, inspected every centimeter. The only thing they managed to find was a yellowish plant material, stuck to the undercarriage, a few small pieces. When it was shown to independent specialists, the petals were identified as star thistle. An expert carefully examined the samples under a microscope. For analysis, they consulted botany specialists from a local university. They explained that this plant is mostly found in pastures, dry meadows, abandoned fields. It was unlikely to have gotten on the car's undercarriage if Douglas hadn't left the city and hadn't been in a meadow near a forest or swampy area, and he claimed he only drove to work and to the restaurant. When detectives returned to the site where Gina's body was found, they easily found star thistle in that location. It grew everywhere. Yellow, prickly flowers. However, this was not 100% proof of the man's guilt. In California, this plant is quite common. It covered about 7% of the state's territory. The man himself was far from a botanist. He shrugged. He suggested the plant could have gotten on the car by chance during his trips to and from the lab. Maybe he drove over some, didn't notice. However, after inspecting the area around his workplace, they concluded this plant does not grow here at all. Although the star thistle didn't seem particularly convincing evidence, it only strengthened the detective's opinion that Douglas was responsible for Gina's death. Naturally, something more substantial was needed to link him to the crime. They needed direct evidence. Since there were no other leads, a more thorough analysis was required. They wanted to match timeframes or determine the exact habitat of the flowers from the main suspect's car undercarriage, to link the plant to the crime scene. They took samples and went to the state's leading plant specialist who worked at the local university, a professor, many years of experience. He used complex research methods, studied the plant's development stages, microscopic analysis. This allowed them to determine the star thistle from the car was at the same stage of development as the plants at the site where the body was found. The same flowering stage, the same structure. It seemed Douglas had been at the crime scene. The car had been there. This further strengthened suspicions against the man. Detectives continued building the case against the deceased stepfather. Now they wanted to determine the nature of the suspicious marks on Gina's legs. Those strange marks that were noticed during the initial examination of the body. According to experts, they could have appeared as a result of prolonged pressure from some foreign object, something heavy, hard. The nature of the marks suggested she received them after death, probably while the body was being transported out of the city, in a car, or somewhere else. One of the medical examiners working on the teenager's body analyzed the marks for a long time. He sat in the lab, looked at photographs, took measurements, until it dawned on him they resembled the upper part of a car's seatbelt buckle. The shape matched. After him, several other experts worked on these marks, an independent examination. They even created a 3D model that confirmed the suspicions. The computer model showed a perfect match. The fact that several independent experts came to the same conclusion seemed like convincing proof to the detectives that the body had been moved in a car, in the back of the car, fastened with a seatbelt. After this, Douglas's car was used for tests again. This time, they wanted to reconstruct the events to understand how such marks could have appeared at all. Detectives stood around the car, discussed, tested different scenarios. They used a mannequin of approximately the same size and weight as Jana. Notably, the man drove a hatchback, one of whose rear seats was broken. It wouldn't fold down. Thus, they found only one way to position the body to leave such marks on it. The victim must have been placed in the back, in the cargo area, and the seatbelts used to immobilize the body on top. According to the medical examiner's hypothesis, the body must have been held immobile for at least 15 minutes, and all this time be pressed tightly by the seatbelt. Pressure, weight. Subsequently, several independent experts analyzed these marks, comparing the reconstruction result with the marks on the deceased schoolgirl's body. The experts were certain. They were identical, a precise match. This conclusion put an end to the investigation. Now all that was left was to convince the jury of the man's guilt, to put everything together into a single picture. To gather the two key pieces of evidence, the star thistle and the seatbelt marks, took law enforcement nearly 2 years. Slow work, examinations, analyses. Douglas Mauser was arrested in 1997. The man was charged with first-degree murder. The whole family was shocked. Kathy cried. Jaron was silent. He denied his guilt and couldn't be broken, even under hours of pressure during interrogations. He sat in the interrogation room, repeated the same thing: "I am innocent." However, the detectives had no doubt about his guilt. For them, everything was clear. The prosecution had its own version of events. They built a clear chain. An acquaintance of the stepfather said that on the eve of the murder, Douglas had a big fight with his stepdaughter over another act of disobedience. Loud voices, a slammed door. The prosecutor believed the stepfather attacked Gina in a fit of rage when he returned home and found her talking on the phone with a friend despite the ban. The man was infuriated by her constant defiance, the last straw. In a fit of rage, he struck her and began to strangle her, hands on her throat. There were no signs of a struggle because the schoolgirl lost consciousness immediately after the first blow. She didn't expect it, didn't have time to react. When Douglas calmed down and realized what had happened, he got scared. Panic. What to do? He could face charges of child abuse. Plus, he valued his job, a secure facility, a high level of clearance. In case of the slightest involvement, he would lose his lucrative position and decent salary. The prosecution believed that, weighing these facts, the stepfather decided it was easier to finish what he started and get rid of the girl than to try to save her. A cold-blooded calculation. From the very beginning, the defense attorney was convinced this theory was far-fetched. He stood in the courtroom, gestured. It sounded unconvincing, even with the collected evidence. Circumstantial evidence, nothing direct. All the prosecution had was Sarah's testimony, who was talking to her friend presumably before the attack. But even she didn't hear why the conversation was cut short. The phone just went silent. The friend couldn't confirm it was the stepfather who had returned home. It could have been anyone. But the prosecutor dissected this point in court, logically, consistently. In his opinion, if a stranger Gina didn't know had entered the house, she would have screamed in fear. She would have asked her friend for help, to call the police. If one of her friends had entered, she wouldn't have hung up. She would have calmly chatted with them in the presence of the friend she was on the phone with. She would have continued the conversation. Only the arrival of her mother or stepfather could have made her hang up to avoid a conflict, fear of punishment. And since her mother had a solid alibi, it was obvious. The stepfather came home. Simple logic. Douglas was the only person in Gina's immediate circle who did not have a confirmed alibi. But that didn't make him a murderer. The lawyer emphasized this. The results of the flour and the seatbelt mark analysis also pointed to him, but indirectly. In the prosecution's view, this was enough. The defense attorney immediately pointed out that all this evidence was circumstantial. The plant, the mark, the lack of an alibi. It was impossible to convict a person of murder based on them. He argued that the real criminal was preparing a new strike, while detectives spent several years punishing an innocent man. A miscarriage of justice. The prosecution told the court they had a recording of a suspicious conversation between the victim's mother and brother, an ace up their sleeve. During their dialogue, the son asked if Douglas could have killed Gina, a direct question. To which Kathy did not give a categorical no, a pause. Instead, she cryptically stated, "You know how Gina was." It seemed that by this she was as if justifying the man's actions, admitting that he could have attacked his daughter in a fit of rage. A mother's doubts. The trial of Gina Gamble began in the middle of summer 1999. 4 years had passed since the murder. Douglas's defense attorney immediately presented an alternative theory, arguing that the prosecution was simply trying to frame a convenient suspect, a convenient scapegoat, since they had no other options. According to the lawyer, Jenna either ran away from home or was attacked inside, but also tried to escape, which is why no signs of a struggle were left in the house. The killer was unknown. The defense attorney was certain the killer was an unknown person who managed to leave no traces and lead the investigation to a dead end. A professional, or a lucky person. The victim's brother dealt weed, that's a fact. A dangerous addict could have come to the house and attacked the girl who was home alone, or at the moment she was trying to sneak out of the house. A random event. Unfortunately, aside from theories, the defense attorney also had nothing to offer the jury, only speculation. Several witnesses testified for the defense, describing Douglas as a decent man. Neighbors, colleagues, friends. Someone for whom violence was completely alien. They had never seen him be aggressive. The entire family maintained that he and Jenna had a wonderful relationship, a loving father. Since both versions resembled theories without a solid evidentiary basis, the jury took a long time to deliberate on the verdict. They deliberated for several days. When they returned to the courtroom, their faces were serious. They stated that they found Douglas Mauser guilty of second-degree murder, not first. He was then sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 15 years. The judge's gavel fell. In 2004, the man tried to file an appeal. New lawyers, new arguments. It was denied, as were all subsequent ones. Door after door closed. Douglas continued to insist on his innocence. He applied for parole several times as soon as he became eligible. 15 years had passed. However, he was denied all 4 times. The reason was the same. It was precisely because he did not admit guilt in his stepdaughter's murder. During his last appeal, the parole board sat across from him. They stated firmly, "If the man does not accept responsibility for his actions, he can remain in prison for the rest of his days." The choice was his. Even so, Douglas, who was 62 at the time, denied any involvement in Gina's death. gray hair, a tired face, although he could have confessed and been released long ago. But the man took a principled stand, not to confess to something he did not do, a line he would not cross. He was serving his sentence at the Chowchilla prison in California. Notably, he did not lose the support of his loved ones and his wife. Kathy continued to believe. Although some town residents considered him guilty, most believed he was not involved in the murder. Conversations in stores, on the streets. They feared that the real killer was still at large, walking among them, and they feared another strike. Who's next? Nevertheless, the Innocence Project declined to take his case. They reviewed the materials. A refusal. Commenting on the trial's outcome, Douglas's lawyer called the case the biggest failure of his life, not even just his career. He sat in his office, looked out the window. He was giving an interview for a crime show and called the case a real tragedy for the Mauser family and for the American justice system as a whole. However, these events were not so painful for everyone. For example, one of the prosecutors involved in convicting Douglas Mauser received a major career boost thanks to the man's imprisonment. A high-profile case, a victory. This caused a wave of outrage in the city. The prosecutor was accused of stepping on others to advance his career, of using the case. In 2004, he achieved another major court victory in a questionable case. Again, circumstantial evidence. And 2 years later, he became the county's district attorney. His career took off. This became just one of the reasons to believe that Douglas Mauser was wrongly convicted. Many of those who followed Jana's case are still convinced of the man's innocence. Internet forums, social media groups, the debates continue. In 2015, the story's heroine's brother passed away, an overdose. The pages of his obituary became another battlefield where concerned people argued, is Douglas Mauser guilty or innocent in Jana's murder? Comments, accusations. Naturally, this had little effect. The case is closed. One of the most ardent supporters of the convicted man was his wife, Kathy, the victim's mother. The woman always maintained that Douglas was a very gentle, calm person. She repeated this to everyone, and that he had never raised a hand to her or her daughter, not once in all their years together. She believed so strongly in his non-involvement in the girl's death that she even moved closer to the prison. She sold the house, rented an apartment. The woman did this to see her husband more often and provide him with comprehensive support, visits every week, phone calls, letters. Kathy hoped that her husband would soon be released. She still hoped. She believed that the defense attorney would succeed in getting the verdict overturned, or at least reduced. Someday. The stepfather never confessed to the crime. He remains behind bars. Because of this, the residents of Modesto wondered, what if he is truly innocent, and a person capable of murder is still living among them, walking the same streets, shopping in the same stores? The question remains open.